I was locked in a hospital room with a ghost. These are the words that began the story of our subscriber. Have you ever worked the night shift? If you have, you know how eerie those late hours can be. Long, empty hallways, flickering lights, and the unsettling feeling that you're not really alone. This is what we will tell you about today. Sit back and relax. Darkness is here. Welcome to the Nightfall. I was locked in a hospital room with a ghost. I never believed in ghost stories. I mean, I like hearing them, sure. The kind you tell around a campfire or watch in some low-budget horror movie. But actually believing them? No way. I was a nurse, a medical professional. I trusted science, facts, things I could see and touch. But then I started working the night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital, and everything changed. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to be haunted. Not some abandoned asylum or a rundown clinic. It was a regular hospital, old but still running, tucked away in a quiet city district. The kind of place where people came in sick and left better. At least most of them did. The night shifts were usually slow. Long, quiet hours spent checking vitals, restocking supplies, and trying to stay awake. The halls always had this eerie silence after midnight, broken only by the occasional beeping of machines or the low murmur of the nurse's station TV. It should have been peaceful, but it never was. I noticed it on my first week. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I heard it, the sound of something moving down the empty hallway. At first, I thought it was just another nurse on their rounds. But when I turned the corner, the hall was empty. The sound had come from room 407. I remember stopping in front of the door, confused. I had seen the patient roster earlier that night. Room 407 was supposed to be empty. I stood there for a second, listening. There was again a soft shuffling sound like someone moving inside. I glanced back at the nurse's station. No one seemed to notice anything strange. I debated whether to ignore it. Maybe I was just imagining things. But my gut told me otherwise. So, I reached for the doorknob. Locked. I knocked. Hello? Anyone in there? No answer. Just silence. I was about to walk away when I felt something. A cold draft, seeping through the tiny crack under the door. It made no sense. The hospital's heating was always running, and the vents weren't anywhere near this room. But the air coming from under that door felt like it came from someplace else. I took a step back. Something about this didn't feel right. I walked back to the nurse's station, trying to act normal. I casually asked my coworker, a senior nurse named Linda, about room 407. She froze. Her face changed in a way that set off every alarm in my head. "We don't use that room," she said quickly. "Forget about it." And then she turned back to her paperwork, ending the conversation. I wanted to press further, but something told me not to. I spent the rest of my shift pretending everything was normal. But I knew one thing for sure. That room wasn't empty. I tried to forget about room 407. I really did. But once you notice something weird, it's like your brain won't let it go. It sits in the back of your mind, whispering, poking at you when you least expect it. For the next few nights, I ignored the hallway altogether. I stuck to my rounds, avoided unnecessary questions, and tried to convince myself that I was just tired. Maybe I really had imagined the noise. Maybe the cold air was just a draft from a vent I hadn't noticed. But then, on the fifth night, it happened again. I was walking past room 407 on my way to the supply closet when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound from behind the locked door. I stopped mid-step. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't loud. It was slow, almost careful, like someone was shuffling their feet across the floor. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at the frosted glass window on the door. A shadow moved inside. I froze. For a second, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe another nurse had gone in without me noticing. Maybe maintenance was checking something. But I knew that wasn't true, because as soon as I turned to face the door properly, the shadow stopped moving. It just stood there. I could feel it, whoever it was, on the other side of the door, watching me. My stomach twisted. The air suddenly felt heavier, thicker. I forced myself to take a step forward and knocked. My voice came out weaker than I expected. "Hello? Is someone in there?" No answer. The shadow didn't move. I swallowed hard and grabbed my keycard. Swipe. Beep. The lock clicked open. I pushed the door just a little, just enough to peek inside. The room was empty, completely untouched. Bed made. Lights off. No signs of movement. I flicked the light switch, scanning every corner of the room. Nothing. But the air, it still felt wrong. It was colder than the rest of the hospital. And even though I was alone, I had the strongest feeling that I wasn't. I backed out and closed the door. That's when I noticed it. The frosted glass window on the door. My stomach dropped. Because before I opened the door, there had been a shadow. And now it was gone. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. I kept replaying the moment in my head, looking for an explanation. But no matter how I looked at it, nothing made sense. There had been someone in that room. I was sure of it. But where did they go? And why did nobody else seem to care? The next night, I tried to avoid the hallway again. I stuck to the other end of the hospital, took the long way around during my rounds. But at exactly 3:07 a.m., something happened that made ignoring room 407 impossible. The phone at the nurse's station rang. I looked at the caller ID. Room 407. My stomach turned ice cold. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. The phone rang again, and again, and again. I swallowed hard and picked it up. Hello. Silence. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a voice whispered through the line, "Don't let them in." The call disconnected. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned to Linda, my senior nurse. She had been watching the whole time, but instead of looking surprised, she just shook her head. "Hang it up next time," she said quietly. Then she turned back to her paperwork. Like this was normal, like this had happened before. That's when I realized something that made my skin crawl. The phone in room 407 wasn't even plugged in. I told myself I wouldn't answer if it rang again. I even pushed the phone across the desk, like putting a little distance between us would make a difference. But it didn't. Because the next night, at exactly 3:07 a.m., it rang again. Room 407. I sat frozen, just staring at the screen. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I glanced at Linda. She didn't even look up this time, like she already knew what was happening, like she expected it. I clenched my jaw and reached for the phone. My fingers hesitated over the receiver. Every instinct screamed at me to hang it up, walk away, pretend I didn't hear it. But I didn't. I answered. "Hello." Silence. But not empty silence. It was the kind of silence that felt full, heavy, thick with something just waiting. A soft, static-like sound crackled through the line. And then, breathing. Slow, uneven, like someone was trying to whisper, but couldn't quite form the words. My skin crawled. Who was this? More silence. Then, just when I thought the call had dropped, "Help me." The words were so quiet, barely more than a breath against my ear. I gripped the phone tighter. "Who are you?" The line crackled. The whisper came again, more desperate this time. "Don't let them in." Then, click. The call ended. I held the phone to my ear for a few seconds, listening to the dead silence before finally setting it down. I turned to Linda, my pulse hammering in my ears. She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "You answered again, didn't you?" I swallowed hard. What the hell was that? She didn't answer. Instead, she just shook her head and stood up, grabbing a folder from the desk. "Look, if you're smart, you'll stop picking up." I frowned. "Linda, this isn't normal. If there's someone in that room, there isn't." The way she said it made my stomach twist, like she wasn't reassuring me, like she was warning me. She turned to leave, but I wasn't done. "Why does it keep calling? Who's saying those things?" Linda stopped in the doorway. For a second, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, finally she spoke. "Nobody's supposed to be in that room." She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at me over her shoulder. "But that doesn't mean it's empty." I couldn't let it go. I knew I should have. Every inch of me screamed to leave it alone, pretend it wasn't happening. But once you hear a voice like that, a voice that shouldn't exist, you can't just forget it. So, before my shift ended, I checked the hospital records. Room 407 had been empty for years. No assigned patients, no scheduled maintenance, nothing. Except, I kept digging, pulling up old digital files from the archive system. And that's when I found it. An old patient log from 1993. Patient name, redacted. Admission date, March 3rd, 1993. Status, no discharge date. No notes. Just a blank space where the status should have been. Like whoever was admitted never left. The next night, The door to room 407 opened on its own, and this time, I wasn't the only one who saw it. I don't know what I expected after finding that patient log. Maybe I thought it was a clerical error, some old file that never got updated. Or maybe I just wanted to believe that, because the alternative, that someone had been admitted and never left, was worse. Either way, I spent my next shift on edge. I kept my distance from room 407. I ignored the way the air felt colder when I passed it. I ignored the whisper in the back of my head telling me that I wasn't imagining things. But then, at exactly 3:07 a.m., it happened again. I was at the nurse's station, filling out reports, when I heard it, a soft click, like a door unlocking. I froze. The hall was quiet. Too quiet. I turned my head slowly, heart pounding. The door to room 407 was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar. Just enough to see the edge of the bed inside. Just enough to make my stomach twist. I stared at it. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't opened it. No one had. I knew it had been locked. I should have called security. I should have turned around and ignored it. But before I could stop myself, I stood up. 1 step. 2 steps. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. Thick. Pressured. Like stepping into deep water. I reached the door. I swallowed hard and pushed it open, just a little more. The room was empty, just like before. The bed was untouched. The window blinds were closed. The air smelled stale, like no one had breathed in here for a long time. But something felt off. I scanned the room. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then, a shadow moved. Not inside the room. Behind me. My breath hitched. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching back toward the nurse's station. I stood there, my whole body locked up, my fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something had been right behind me, watching. I forced myself to back up, step by step, until I was out of the room. Then I grabbed the door handle and pulled it shut. Click. I didn't wait. I turned and walked back to the nurse's station as fast as I could without making it obvious that I was practically running. Linda was there. She looked up as soon as she saw my face. You saw it, didn't you? I stared at her. Saw what? She sighed, shaking her head. You shouldn't have opened that door. I felt cold all over. Then why did it open by itself? She didn't answer. She just picked up her pen and went back to her paperwork. Like she already knew how this was going to end. That night, when I got home, I dreamed about the shadow. It was standing behind me, just out of sight. And this time, in the dream, it whispered my name. I woke up drenched in sweat. The dream had felt too real. The shadow behind me. The whisper. My name. I couldn't shake the feeling, even after I showered and had my morning coffee. It clung to me like a weight in my chest. By the time I clocked in for my shift that night, I had made up my mind. I needed answers. I waited until my rounds were done, then slipped into the hospital's archive room. The archive was a cold, windowless space in the basement, filled with rows of metal shelves stacked with patient files. Most of the records were digital now, but the older ones, the ones no one wanted to talk about, were still kept down here. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed as I ran my fingers along the dusty labels. 407. That's what I was looking for. And then, there it was. A thin folder. Too thin. I pulled it out and flipped it open. No discharge date. No notes. Just a single admission record from March 3rd, 1993. Patient name. Redacted. Diagnosis. Not applicable. Notes. Patient was admitted under special circumstances. Do not reassign room. That was it. No explanation. No details. Nothing. Like whoever this person was, they had been erased. I scanned the page, looking for anything else, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the corner of the page, barely visible, was a handwritten note in faded ink. Still here. My hand started shaking. I snapped the folder shut and shoved it back onto the shelf. I needed to get out of there. I turned and froze. There was someone standing at the end of the aisle. Tall, motionless, just a dark silhouette against the dim light. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then, the light flickered, and the figure was gone. I ran back upstairs. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, my pulse still pounding. Linda was there, going through a chart. She looked up, saw my face, and sighed. You went digging, didn't you? I swallowed hard. Who was in that room, Linda? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced around, like she was checking to make sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in, voice low. It's not about who was in that room. She hesitated. It's about who never left. That was the moment I realized something. Room 407 wasn't just haunted. It was occupied. After my shift, I sat in my car for almost an hour before driving home. I couldn't stop thinking about what Linda had said. It's about who never left. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. That whisper. By the time I clocked in the next night, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going near room 407. I wasn't looking at it. I wasn't thinking about it. But then, something happened that made it impossible to ignore. It was around 2:45 a.m. when I went to check on one of our older patients, Mr. Gardner. He was in his late 70s, admitted for a mild stroke. He was recovering well, alert, and always polite. A regular patient. But tonight, something was wrong. I walked into his room and immediately felt it. The air was cold, colder than the rest of the hospital. Mr. Gardner was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall. He didn't acknowledge me when I walked in. Mr. Gardner? I asked, checking his four. How are you feeling? He didn't answer. His lips were moving, but there was no sound. A slow, silent whisper. My stomach twisted. Mr. Gardner? I stepped closer. Are you okay? That's when he grabbed my wrist. His grip was ice cold. I gasped, trying to pull back, but he held on tight. His eyes were wide, terrified. Then, finally, he whispered. They watched from the empty rooms. My blood ran cold. I opened my mouth to say something, but he wasn't done. His voice dropped lower, barely more than a breath. Don't answer when they call. A shiver ran down my spine. Oh, I whispered. Mr. Gardner's whole body tensed. His breathing turned shallow, ragged. His lips trembled. Then, he jerked forward like something had grabbed him. The machines beside him beeped wildly. His eyes rolled back. He started gasping, clawing at his throat. I panicked. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, stay with me. I hit the call button. A second later, 2 other nurses ran in. One of them, James, grabbed his shoulders while the other checked his vitals. But something was wrong. His heart rate was normal. His oxygen levels were fine. There was nothing medically wrong with him. But he kept convulsing, shaking like something was pulling at him. I backed away, my heart hammering. And then, just as suddenly as it started, he stopped. His whole body relaxed. His breathing steadied. He blinked, looking around the room like he had just woken up. James sighed in relief. Jesus, you scared us, Mr. G. But Mr. Gardner just turned to me. His voice was clear this time. Calm. You answered, didn't you? I didn't sleep when I got home. I didn't want to sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again. That whisper. And this time it wasn't just in my head. It was right next to my ear. Don't let them in. I came back to work the next night, but I didn't want to be there. I had spent the whole day in a haze, replaying Mr. Gardner's words over and over again. You answered, didn't you? What did that mean? Who? Or what had I answered? I wanted to believe it was just an old man rambling. But deep down, I knew better. And at 3:07 a.m., I got my answer. I was passing room 407 when I felt it again. The air, heavy, thick, pressured. I didn't stop walking. I kept my head down and moved fast, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened the closer I got. Then, a slow, creaking sound. I stopped. The hairs on my arm stood up. I turned my head. The door to room 407 was opening. All on its own. I froze. The hinges groaned, the door inching open painfully slow. My breath hitched in my throat. There was no one inside. But that feeling, that awful, suffocating feeling, was pouring out of the room like cold air leaking from a freezer. Then, just as the door opened wide enough to see the bed, a sound, a soft shuffle, like someone moving inside. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty. The nurse's station was too far away. It was just me, and whatever was inside that room. I turned to leave. Then I heard it. A whisper. Right behind me. Not from inside the room. Behind me. A breath against my ear. Stay. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. Nothing. just the empty hallway stretching behind me. My hands were shaking. My skin was ice cold. I turned back to room 407. The door was wide open now. The bed inside was empty. But on the white sheets, there was something that hadn't been there before. A single, yellowed patient file. And it was open. I didn't want to go inside. Every cell in my body screamed at me to walk away. But I had to know. Slowly, I reached for the file. The pages were old, stained with age. And then I saw the name. My stomach dropped. It was the same file I had found in the basement archives. The same one that should have been locked away. But this time, there was something different. At the bottom of the last page, where before there had been nothing but an empty space, there was now a single line of handwritten text. Fresh, as if someone had written it just moments ago. For words. I never left. I dropped the file and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, gasping for breath. Linda looked up at me, expression unreadable. You saw it, didn't you? She said. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She sighed. You should have never answered that phone. I swallowed hard. Who is JD? Linda didn't answer right away. Then, finally, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, she said, the last patient of room 407. I came back to work the next night, but I didn't want to be there. I had spent the whole day in a haze, replaying Mr. Gardner's words over and over again. You answered, didn't you? What did that mean? Who? Or what had I answered? I wanted to believe it was just an old man rambling, but deep down I knew better. And at 3:07 a.m., I got my answer. I was passing room 407 when I felt it again. The air, heavy, thick, pressured. I didn't stop walking. I kept my head down and moved fast, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened the closer I got. Then, a slow, creaking sound. I stopped. The hairs on my arm stood up. I turned my head. The door to room 407 was opening. All on its own. I froze. The hinges groaned, the door inching open painfully slow. My breath hitched in my throat. There was no one inside. But that feeling, that awful, suffocating feeling, was pouring out of the room like cold air leaking from a freezer. Then, just as the door opened wide enough to see the bed, a sound, a soft shuffle, like someone moving inside. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty. The nurse's station was too far away. It was just me, and whatever was inside that room. I turned to leave. Then I heard it. A whisper. Right behind me. Not from inside the room. Behind me. A breath against my ear. Stay. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching behind me. My hands were shaking. My skin was ice cold. I turned back to room 407. The door was wide open now. The bed inside was empty. But on the white sheets, there was something that hadn't been there before. A single, yellowed patient file. And it was open. I didn't want to go inside. Every cell in my body screamed at me to walk away. But I had to know. Slowly, I reached for the file. The pages were old, stained with age. And then I saw the name. My stomach dropped. It was the same file I had found in the basement archives. The same one that should have been locked away. But this time, there was something different. At the bottom of the last page, where before there had been nothing but an empty space, there was now a single line of handwritten text. Fresh, as if someone had written it just moments ago. For words. I never left. I dropped the file and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the nurse's station, gasping for breath. Linda looked up at me, expression unreadable. You saw it, didn't you? She said. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She sighed. You should have never answered that phone. I swallowed hard. Who is JD? Linda didn't answer right away. Then, finally, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, she said. The last patient of room 407. I told myself I was done. I had my answers. I knew who JD was. I knew what had happened, at least as much as anyone could know. But knowing didn't make it better. It didn't make the whispers stop. And on my next shift, I realized something terrifying. JD wasn't done with me. It was just after 3 a.m. when it started. I was at the nurse's station, filling out charts, when the air suddenly felt wrong. Thick, cold, pressured, like something was watching me. I glanced around. The hallways were empty. The other nurses were either in patient rooms or on break. Then, the phone rang. I froze. I didn't want to look. I already knew what the caller ID would say. But my eyes betrayed me. Room 407. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I wasn't going to answer. I wasn't. But then the phone rang again, and again, and again, until it was a constant, high-pitched ringing that wouldn't stop. I reached for it with a shaking hand and picked up. I didn't say anything. For a second, there was only silence. Then, a whisper. "Help me." I squeezed my eyes shut. "JD." The static on the line crackled. "They're coming." My stomach dropped. "Oh, who's coming?" The line went dead. And then, from down the hall, bang, bang, bang. The door to room 407 was shaking. I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. I should have run, but instead, I moved forward, heart hammering. The hallway felt longer, the air thicker. Every step I took felt like walking through wet cement. As I got closer, I realized the door wasn't just shaking. It was pounding, like something inside was trying to get out. I reached for my key card, hands trembling. Swipe. Beep. The lock clicked open, and then, silence. The door slowly swung open on its own. I stepped inside, and then I heard it, a sound that made my whole body go rigid. A slow, dragging noise. Something moving behind me. I turned my head, and I wasn't alone. The room was dark, darker than it should have been. The hallway light should have cast at least some glow inside, but somehow, the shadows stretched too deep. I stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, and then I stopped, because there was someone sitting on the bed. I felt my chest tighten. My breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't moving, just sitting there, hunched slightly, its head tilted downward. I swallowed hard. My voice barely came out. "JD." The air was thick. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then, slowly, the figure lifted its head. My stomach dropped. It was him, the man from the old newspaper clipping, Jonathan Davis. But his eyes, hollow, dark, like there was nothing left behind them. His mouth twitched just slightly, a hint of something that could have been a smile. Then he spoke, but his lips didn't move. The words weren't spoken out loud. They were inside my head. "You let them in?" Every muscle in my body locked up. I wanted to move. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The air around me was too heavy, too thick, like invisible hands were pressing against my chest. I couldn't breathe. Then, behind him, in the darkest part of the room, something else shifted. A shape, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the lighting, just my mind playing tricks. But then it moved, tall, too tall. A thin, stretching figure standing just behind JD, watching. And then I realized it wasn't standing. It was crawling, crawling up the walls. A deep, rattling breath filled the room. Not from JD, not from me, from the thing in the corner. JD's head snapped toward me. Too fast, unnatural. And then, finally, his lips moved. "Run." Something slammed the door shut behind me. The lights flickered. Once, twice, then everything went black. And in the darkness, I heard them, the whispers. Hundreds of them, all at once, surrounding me. "He never left. It's still here. You let them in." The room felt smaller. The shadows pressed in. And then, just before everything went completely dark, I felt something grab my wrist. I woke up on the floor. My head was pounding. My skin was ice cold. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then it hit me. Room 407. I sat up fast, heart hammering. My hands were shaking. My uniform was damp with sweat. The room was empty. No JD. No thing in the corner. The door was wide open. And the worst part? Everything looked normal. I stumbled out into the hallway. The nurse's station was just ahead. Bright, quiet, safe. I walked toward it, legs weak. My stomach twisted. Linda was there. She looked up as soon as she saw me. And then, her face changed. Not surprised. Not concerned. Just tired. Like she had seen this happen before. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. "Did you?" My throat was dry. I swallowed hard. "Did you hear anything?" She sighed. "You were gone for 20 minutes. My pulse stopped. "That's not possible," I whispered. Linda didn't answer. I ran a hand through my hair, my fingers still trembling. Linda, I saw him. JD. He spoke to me. And there was something else. Something in the room. I expected her to deny it, to tell me I was imagining things. But she just looked at me. And that was worse, because it meant she already knew. I shook my head. I need to tell someone. Security. The doctors. Someone has to. Linda's voice was sharp. No. I stopped. She leaned in, eyes serious. You think you're the first one this has happened to? I stared at her. You think you're the only one who's gone into that room and seen things they shouldn't have? My stomach turned. Then why is no one doing anything? She exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. Because no one believes it. And the ones who do. She hesitated. I felt a chill run down my spine. What? She looked at me, her voice quiet. They don't last long. I went home at dawn. I should have slept. I should have tried to forget. But I couldn't. Because no matter how hard I tried, I could still hear the whispers. And I could still feel it. That thing in the room. Watching. Waiting. I quit my job at St. Vincent's the next day. I didn't give a 2-week notice. I didn't pack up my locker. I just walked into my supervisor's office, handed him my badge, and left. She didn't ask why. Maybe she already knew. I tried to move on. Tried to convince myself that it had all been stress. Sleep deprivation. A hallucination. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That whatever had been in room 407 wasn't done with me. I moved to a new city. Got a new job at a private clinic. Day shifts only. No more hospitals. No more empty hallways at 3 a.m. For a while, I felt normal again. I started sleeping better. I stopped waking up in cold sweats. The whispers faded. But then, one night, **, 3 months later, **, it happened. I was sitting in my apartment, watching TV, when my phone rang. Nothing unusual. Until I looked at the screen. No number. No caller ID. Just 2 words. Room 407. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, my hands frozen, my breath caught in my throat. It rang again, and again, and again. I almost threw my phone across the room, but before I could move, it stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just some glitch. Then, my voicemail notification popped up. One new message. My heart pounded. My whole body felt ice cold. I didn't want to listen to it, but I did. Click. At first just static, then breathing. Slow, uneven, and then a whisper. You let them in? Click. The message ended. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I could feel something behind me, watching, waiting, and this time I knew it had followed me. Some places hold memories. Others hold something worse. Room 407 was never just an empty hospital room. It was waiting, watching. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A place, a moment, a presence that still haunts you? If you have a terrifying story of your own, send it to us. Our email is in the video description, and we'll feature the scariest ones in future episodes. Until next time, keep your doors locked. And whatever you do, don't answer the call.